Hello everybody, I'm Stephanie. Today we're looking at the last of the 4 areas in dealing with low back pain, which is traction. So for today, you're going to need a block, a bolster, or a pillow. And at the very end, I'm going to show you one new thing that you can use to help with low back pain. So join me on your mat wherever you're at, and let's get started. So in the videos of this previous series, we've been looking at reasons why we might have low back pain and some things that we can do to not only alleviate that, but to rebuild some strength in the body. So first we looked at regaining some balance in our body and getting that inflammation down. We also looked at building some strength to hold that balance in our body. Then we looked at building some flexibility in our body in the correct way, allowing our pelvis to move with either the legs or with the spine. And today we're finishing up our time with low back pain and bringing some traction into this. So as you're beginning to heal and feel better, it's really important to create that space along the spine and between the spine and the pelvis, between the L5 and the S1. And we want to create that room so that the vertebrae that are already kind of inflamed, we're giving them room to kind of heal. And if you've lost any of the functionality there, if you've had a herniated disc or a bulging disc, you know, you've lost some of that disc space. We want to create just a little bit. So it's not creating tons and tons of inches, but it might just be millimeters, but it's enough to really alleviate the pain and get that pressure off of the nerves. And it's really important for healing too. We want to create that space in our bodies. So there's a couple of things that we can do to create some gentle space. And one of the first things that we can do is to come into child's pose. And this is one that we do in almost every single one of our times together because it is so important. But we really want to look at the way that we're doing child's pose. It's not just letting everything coming down to the ground. So beginning in tabletop, wrists underneath your shoulders, knees underneath your hips, toes touching, knees apart, finding that neutral flat back, so we're not arching, and then very gently reaching the tailbone back, keeping that neutral flat back. But what happens a lot of times is when people are coming into child's pose, they find that arch and then they press back into that arch, and that's not what we want to do. We want to really create some traction. So neutral flat back, reaching the tailbone back, and at the same time reaching the palms forward. And we're thinking of this traction reaching forward through the crown and back through the hips. So we're really stretching through the spine, but we want to make sure again that we keep that neutral flat back because we don't want to overarch in the low back. The main movement is going to become from the center of the back, from the thoracic spine. So really reaching forward through the crown and back through the hips. And you might not even get the forehead down to the mat, and that's not really the goal. We're looking for traction here. So if you feel the spine begin to curl down as you reach the forehead to the mat, maybe you grab a block instead and just keep the forehead lifted so you can really concentrate on reaching forward through the crown and back through the hips. And then just breathing here mentally, imagine sending your breath in between all of the vertebrae in the spine and then down between the spine and the hips, because that tends to be a big hot spot there. Just very gently breathing here. But continue to reach the crown forward and the hips back. So you're actively stretching. And you should be feeling this length right in the center of the back. Excuse me, cat. So just coming into a very gentle child's pose is one option to bring some traction into your practice. Another thing that you can do is to come into cat. So we bring the knees underneath the hips, the wrists underneath the shoulders. And on your exhale, reaching the spine up and pressing down into your mat. And when it comes to low back pain, making sure, again, I know I'm saying this a lot, but the movement's coming from the center of the back and you're not pressing the hips forward. That's going to stretch that low back that we don't want to stretch. That's where all the inflammation is, because it's been stretched so much. We want to let that inflammation come back down in the low back. And just spending a few breaths here. And then changing that, holding the cat pose to the cow and cat pose. So inhale, drop your core, gently lift your hips, lift your crown, back bend cow. Exhale, spine towards the ceiling, press away from your mat, cat. Just taking a few of those so you can get some traction with your cat. So you got child's pose, cat pose, and one thing that we can do is just coming into a very conscious standing pose. So the ankles underneath the hips, neutral tailbone, so we're not over accentuating, sticking the tailbone back, we're not sticking it forward, but we're allowing that natural arch, but really thinking of length, 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 standing as tall as you can. Inhaling, arms are going to reach up overhead and really stretching through the crown. So it's not coming from the shoulders. I'm not reaching my arms up out of the sockets. Those arms are still down and back. The shoulders are down and back, but I want to stretch again up through the crown and down through the heels. Belly button's pulling in, and it's just very, very gentle traction. And if it doesn't feel good to bring those arms up overhead, they can come down by your side. But again, think nice and tall. So as we're going about our normal everyday lives, we're creating this traction. Another thing you can do is grab a pillow or a bolster, and you're gonna place it right at the hips, bending the knees deep enough, reaching the crown forward, and just allow that bolster to be right at the hip crease, and then getting those elbows and pressing the elbows back into the bolster. You can bring the palms together if you'd like to. And then really thinking, stretching forward through the crown and back through the hips. So thinking inhale, forward through the crown, exhale, press into those elbows, reach back through the hips. Very, very gentle pressure here. Keeping that bend in the knees, so we're not straightening the knees. We're not worried about bringing the intention to the hamstrings here. We're wanting to create traction in the back. And breathing here for a little bit. And then very gently coming back up, removing that bolster. Another thing you can do is coming down onto your back. Excuse me, cat. Goodness gracious, you just want to be part of this today, don't you? Coming into your bridge pose. So walking the feet in, ankles underneath the knees, knees as wide as the hips, neutral back, and then taking your palms and with your exhale very gently at the top of the thighs, right into the hip crease, pressing away, creating this traction. So you should feel this length. We're opening up as you're pressing down. The pelvis is pulling down and then reaching up above through your crown. So stretching again that pelvis away from the spine. And if your arms are a little bit shorter and you're struggling to kind of find that pressure, you can use fists instead. And that might even be more comfortable even if you have longer arms, because then you can rest the elbows on the ground. But really feeling this length as the pelvis is going down and the spine is reaching up. And then breathing here. It's just very, very subtle movements. And another thing you can do is come into a supported bridge, and you're going to need your block here. And you can do this on level 1 or level 2. I would just say 1 or 2 just to be gentle. And you're going to lift the hips and place that right at the top of the pelvis, so not the low back. And you want to make sure that it's wide enough that it's right underneath the hips there. And then very, very gently, the knees are going to come over the hips. And this is just a very gentle inversion. The hips are lifting up and gravity's pulling the spine down. So it's, again, very, very subtle traction on the low back. Just staying here and breathing for a few moments. And then very gently bringing the feet back down, lift the hips, remove that block. The last thing you can do on your mat is to come into a supported fish. So you want to get a nice long pillow, or you might need a couple of pillows here. But something that you can open up with. Hips are going to stay down, so you're not sitting on the pillow, but it's coming right up against the low back, and then very gently leaning back. And I want to keep this openness. Again, making sure you've got enough support underneath the head. But I'm opening things up, creating this traction, opening up the front of the spine. Very, very gentle back bend here. Creating this room again. Sending breath into the vertebrae, in between the spine and the hips and the SI joints. And just staying here as long as it feels comfortable. And then very gently coming up, back up. There's one other thing that you can do that's a little bit more intense, and I have loved it. It has been something that saved my low back when I was in such excruciating pain over the past few months. When I first started this series, the whole reason I started it, and it was taking a look at some of the things that you can do to create traction on the yoga trapeze. And this is not an advertisement for it. This is just something that I have really fallen in love with. So if that's something that you're interested in, stay with me, and we're going to flip over and look at the yoga trapeze and ways that you can create traction there. So one of the final ways that you can create traction and help alleviate pain in the low back is to use the yoga trapeze. What this does is it really helps to create the same thing as an inversion table, but for some people, inversion tables, and it's very interesting, when you're hanging at an angle, it tends to create a lot of pressure in your head and your ankles are locked in. And for me, it makes me feel very, very lightheaded and a lot of pressure in my head. But for some reason, when I'm hanging upside down, completely inverted in the yoga trapeze, I don't quite have as much pressure in my head. And because it's hooked in to around your pelvis and your hips, you can really get that traction that we're looking for in the low back to really open up some space in the vertebrae, to open up some space between the L5 and the S1, between the hips and between the low back, which that seems to be a hot spot for a lot of people. So I'm going to show you just some very easy things that you can do with one of these. You can get on the internet and get one of these for yourself pretty cheaply and just hook it in. I have mine just screwed into some supports in the ceiling, and it supports not just me, but it supports heavier people, and my husband hangs on this quite a bit too. So it is very well built. So I'm going to show you two things that can really create some traction in your back. And the first one is called, aptly, Traction Jackson. I'm going to come to you backwards. I know my back is to you, but you're going to take the edge of the main sling and grab it, butterfly your hands at your waist, and press up to find your seat, making sure that the black clips are slid down to kind of shorten the seat. You're going to bicycle your legs until the material is right underneath your bum at the very, very top of the hamstrings. And then grabbing the back of the material, getting it down so that it's as small as it can be on your seat, leaning back until it catches there, because I want to keep it real small. Grabbing those middle and the long straps, opening them up wide, and then as I lean back, I'm going to V my legs super, super wide. And then double cross my legs. My feet are going to come to the inside and toes hook. Now before I let down, I want to make sure that this material is comfortable. So everybody does different things. You might shorten the material, kind of bring it down the legs a little bit. If it's pulling into the low back, you can even pull that material away so that it's right underneath the pelvis. So everybody does this a little bit differently. They may like it bigger, they might like it smaller. My animals like it when I hang upside down. But because of the way that this is built, it's very, very different than hanging on an inversion table where you're hooked in at your feet. Instead, it is hooked in at the hips. So the hips are pulling up, and then gravity is pulling the rest of your body down. And it's very, very gentle. And this is an amazing feeling. When I was going through my low back pain earlier in this year, when I did my first video after I was starting to feel better, this is one of the things that really, really helped. So coming here and just hanging out. So maybe you bring your arms down above your head towards the floor and grab opposite elbows. And just breathe here. So it's very natural when you first come upside down to feel a little lightheaded, to feel a little nauseous, and instead of just saying, oh, I can't do this, I gotta come back up, really giving your body a moment to adjust and to breathe here. So big, deep breaths as you're breathing in, letting the belly fill up, and breathing out, belly buttons pulling in. And if you're not feeling quite secure in here, some people, they can't quite hook their legs in, and the reason is because they're not bending the knees. So making sure you've got that deep, deep bend in the knees so that you're hooked in. And then you're not going anywhere. The legs are wrapped around. Just let your body weight. You create the traction in your body. So hanging here for a few moments. And all you really need is to be hanging here for about 5 to 7 minutes, and it's going to create that traction in your back. And when you're ready to come back up, you're going to look up at your toes, grab your long straps, open them up wide, unhook your feet, V the feet nice and wide, and walk your hands back up the straps. Taking a rest here, wrap your arms around the main sling and take a break. And I'm going to come back to the front here. So you're just wrapping your arms around the rig and taking a break as you're seated in that main sling. So that's one of the main ways that you can use this to create some traction in your back. One other thing that you can do is creating some traction with down dog. So this is what we call a flying down dog, and it's really kind of lifting things up. So what you're going to do is you're going to come behind the main sling. You're going to bunch up the material, open it up kind of like a belt, and then you're placing it at the hip crease. So one of the things that people tend to do when they're coming into this flying down dog is they put it at the waistline. As we've talked about, there is not a hinge here. The hinge is at the hips. So really making sure that this material is at the hips. And then I'm going to keep that there and walk forward until that material catches. And I hope you're not losing me here, but making sure it stays at the hips. Then reaching my hands down and walking my feet back. So you can kind of see I'm still creating this down dog, but the sling is lifting my hips up. And then coming into that same shape, your down dog, pressing the palms into the mat and really reaching the hips back and up. But it's pulling up on my hips. I know I've said before in some of my previous videos, when you come into this position, to imagine someone's coming behind you and pulling on the hip points back and up. And so that's essentially what this is doing. Is it's pulling on those hip points back and up and creating this traction. And it feels just so amazing when you have low back pain. And then very, very gently walking the feet back up, bending the knees, core pulls in, and you come just back up as we do in our mat-based classes. So those are two ways that you can use this contraption. If you are not wanting to buy one and do it yourself, you might be able to find somebody in your area that teaches private lessons. If you're close to me, you can come and do a private lesson with me, and I also teach group classes at some of the studios that I teach at. But thank you so much for joining me today with our last video looking at traction for low back pain. Blessings and namaste.